It begins in a place where nothing is supposed to begin, a place designed not for discovery, but for containment. A federal records facility outside Washington, D.C., sometime in the late 1970s, where rows of steel shelves stretch into dim distance, and the air is held in a careful balance, dry and cold enough to preserve paper, but not memory. This is where history settles when it is no longer needed, where documents become objects, and objects become quiet. A man sits alone at a table beneath a fluorescent light that hums with a constant, almost indifferent rhythm. He is not a historian, not a researcher, not someone trained to question what passes through his hands. His job is simple, procedural, and unremarkable. Open the box, confirm its contents, assign its place, and move on. That is how the system works. That is how it has always worked. And yet, on this particular day, something arrives that does not follow that pattern. The box is unmarked, except for a fading stencil, barely visible under layers of age and handling. Polar Survey Materials, 1940. No department seal, no origin file, no clear path explaining how it came to be here. Just a container without context, resting quietly among thousands of others that never asked to be remembered. He hesitates, though he cannot explain why. It is not fear, not exactly. It is something softer, something quieter, like the sense that this box does not belong to the order it has been placed within. But hesitation does not exist in procedure, and so he breaks the brittle seal and lifts the lid. Inside, the first thing he notices is the care. The maps are folded with precision, edges aligned as if they had been handled deliberately, not rushed, not discarded. The paper is thick, aged in a way that suggests preservation rather than neglect. Beneath them, an envelope rests alone, sealed, with a handwritten note that has almost faded into the fibers of the paper itself: do not reproduce. The words are not emphasized, not underlined, not marked as urgent, and yet they carry a weight that does not match their simplicity. He sets the envelope aside, almost instinctively, as if something about it suggests it should come later. Instead, he unfolds the first map. At a distance, it appears familiar. Antarctica, rendered in pale gradients, its edges uncertain, its interior mostly undefined. The kind of map that belongs to early survey attempts, when much of the continent remained a question rather than a known entity. It aligns with what history books describe, with what official records have preserved, with what we were taught to accept as the early understanding of a distant, frozen world. Vast, empty, unclaimed by structure or pattern. But then, as he leans closer, smoothing the surface with his hands, something interrupts that expectation. A line, not curved, not softened by the natural irregularities of terrain, but straight, subtly so, almost hesitant, as if it were trying not to be noticed. He pauses, his finger tracing along it, unsure at first if what he is seeing is intentional or imagined. The line continues further than expected, and then it turns, not gradually, not in a natural arc, but sharply, forming an angle that feels too precise to ignore. He follows it, slowly now, more carefully, and finds another line intersecting it. Then another. The pattern does not reveal itself all at once. It emerges in fragments, like something half hidden beneath the surface of awareness. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. Straight edges, clean intersections, repeating alignments, not random, not chaotic, but organized in a way that suggests design. He leans back slightly, the hum of the light above him suddenly more present, more intrusive. There is no legend explaining these forms, no annotation clarifying their purpose. They exist on the map, but they are not acknowledged by it, as if someone had recorded them, but chosen not to explain them. The possibility of error crosses his mind, briefly. A drafting anomaly, a misalignment during printing, something technical, something harmless. But the more he studies the lines, the less they feel accidental. They repeat, they connect. They maintain consistency across distances that would not support coincidence. He reaches for the second map, unfolding it with the same care, the same growing attention. This one is more detailed, focused on a smaller region. And there, again, the lines appear. Clearer now, though still faint, as if intentionally subdued. The same angles, the same intersections, the same quiet insistence that something exists here that does not belong to ice or erosion or natural formation. Near the edge of the map, he notices a fragment of handwriting, almost erased, The ink faded into near invisibility. He adjusts the angle, bringing it closer to the light. Alignment confirmed. The words are incomplete, the rest lost or removed, but what remains is enough to change how the map feels in his hands. The room does not change, not physically, but something in its atmosphere shifts. The silence becomes heavier, more aware, as if the space itself has registered what has been noticed. He reaches for the envelope. This time, there is no hesitation. The seal cracks as it opens, the paper inside sliding free with a dry, fragile sound. A photograph. Black and white, grainy, its edges worn. At first glance, it shows nothing. Just an expanse of white, endless, undisturbed. But then, slowly, as his eyes adjust, something begins to emerge. A shadow beneath the surface. Not cast by anything visible, but present in a way that suggests depth. It stretches across the frame, forming edges that echo the lines on the map. Straight, defined, intersecting. A geometry that feels deliberate, yet impossible within the context it occupies. He tilts the photograph slightly, expecting the shape to dissolve, to resolve into something more familiar. It does not. It remains, unchanged, as if anchored beneath the surface of the image itself. Beneath the photograph, another sheet waits, thin, almost translucent, as if added later. He lifts it carefully. It is a tracing. The same shapes, simplified, outlined with a steadier hand. The lines are darker here, more certain, more confident. And at the center, where the intersections converge, there is a mark, not a coordinate, not a label, a symbol. He does not recognize it, and yet it carries a familiarity that he cannot place, as if it belongs to something he has seen before, but cannot remember where. He lowers the sheet, placing it back into the envelope, his movements slower now, more deliberate. The room returns to its quiet rhythm, but the quiet is no longer empty. It feels occupied, as if something has shifted, something that cannot be reversed. He looks again at the maps, at the lines, at the intersections that should not exist, and a question begins to form, quietly at first, then with increasing weight. If these shapes were recorded in 1940, if they were mapped, photographed, traced, then why do they not appear anywhere in what we were taught? Why are they absent from official records, from the narratives that define how we understand Antarctica? He closes the box slowly, aligning the edges with care, as if restoring something that had been disturbed. The faded stencil on the lid offers no answers. Polar Survey Materials, 1940. Nothing more, no reference to structures, no acknowledgement of anomaly. He lifts the box and carries it toward the shelves, where countless other containers rest in ordered silence, each one representing a version of history that has been accepted, catalogued, and left alone. He pauses before placing it among them. Just for a moment, because somewhere beneath the ice, in a place no one had reason to question, something had been seen. Not fully understood, not clearly defined, but enough to leave a trace, enough to be recorded. And then, something changed. He slides the box into its place, stepping back as the rows of shelves close around it, absorbing it into the quiet certainty of stored memory. But as he turns away, the question does not fade. It remains, persistent, unresolved, not what was found, but why it was never meant to be understood. It might have ended there, quietly, as so many things do in places like that, absorbed into the system, reduced to a number, a location, a reference that no one would think to revisit. But certain details do not stay where they are placed. They linger, not as clear memories, not as defined images, but as a kind of pressure, something that returns in fragments, something that refuses to settle. And for the man who had opened that box, the lines did not disappear. They reappeared in small moments, in pauses between tasks, in the quiet seconds where thought moves without direction. Straight edges beneath ice, intersections without explanation. A phrase, barely visible, alignment confirmed. It did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like the beginning of something that had never been finished. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the work continued. Boxes arrived, were opened, checked, and stored. The process did not change, but his attention did. It moved differently now, slower in certain moments, sharper in others, as if something had adjusted the way he noticed things. And then, without warning, another fragment appeared. Not from the same box, not from the same collection, but from a separate transfer entirely. a set of typed documents, bundled together, marked as Antarctic survey logs from the early 1940s. Routine material, the kind that rarely held anything beyond weather reports and technical observations, the kind that passed through unnoticed because it was expected to contain nothing unexpected. He began reading without intention, simply following procedure, verifying content against index entries, but almost immediately, something felt off. Not in what the documents described, but in how they were written. There were inconsistencies, subtle at first, almost invisible unless compared side by side. Paragraphs that seemed to repeat with slight variations, sentences that shifted tone without clear reason, words that appeared to have been replaced, not erased, but rewritten to fit a different meaning. It was not a clean edit, it was layered. As if the original text had not been removed, only adjusted, softened, redirected. He slowed his reading, paying closer attention now. Names appeared in the personnel list, each one typed in uniform format, aligned perfectly. But one name appeared again later in the document, slightly altered, the typeface different, the spacing uneven. A correction, perhaps, or something more deliberate. The name itself did not stand out. It belonged to an observer, not a commanding officer, not someone whose role would carry weight in official summaries. An observer's job is to watch, to record, to notice what others might not. The kind of role that exists quietly, without recognition. He searched for that name again. It appeared within the body of the report, attached to a series of brief entries. Short sentences, technical in tone, but carrying something else beneath the surface. The first seemed ordinary enough. Ice conditions, wind direction, visibility. But then, within the same paragraph, there was a line that did not belong. It did not break the structure, but it shifted it. Surface irregularity observed beyond expected formation parameters. He read it again, slower this time. The words avoided clarity. They described something without naming it, something that did not fit within the categories the report was designed to contain. It was precise, but incomplete, controlled, but uncertain. He moved to the next page. The same paragraph appeared again, but the sentence was gone. In its place, a more familiar description had been inserted. Something about ice variation, density changes, the kind of language that aligns with expectation. The original line had not been fully removed. It remained faintly visible beneath the newer text, as if preserved unintentionally, or perhaps intentionally, in a way that did not draw attention. He felt the same quiet shift as before, the same subtle awareness that something was not being erased, only reshaped. He continued reading. The observer's entries were consistent in their brevity. No extended explanations, no speculative language, just fragments, notes, observations that hinted at something larger without committing to it. And yet, across multiple entries, certain patterns began to repeat. Edges do not conform to natural drift. Angles persist across distance, formation visible under low-angle light. Each sentence stood alone, but together they formed a pattern that echoed what he had seen on the maps. Lines, angles, repetition. Not random, not chaotic, but structured in a way that did not belong to natural formation. The language remained restrained, as if the observer was aware of the limits of what could be said, or perhaps the limits of what would be accepted. And then the entries stopped. No conclusion. No final note. The observer's voice disappeared without transition, replaced by standard logs, routine descriptions, the kind of content that blends seamlessly into official records. The shift was abrupt, but unacknowledged. No indication of why the entries ended, no reference to reassignment, no explanation at all. He searched for the name again. It appeared once more, in a transfer record. Reassigned. No reason given. No additional documentation attached. Just absence. The document closed itself around that absence, continuing forward as if nothing had changed, as if the interruption had not occurred, as if the observer had never written those lines at all. The man sat back in his chair, the weight of the room settling around him once again. The hum of the lights, the stillness of the air, the quiet certainty of everything that had already been processed and stored. And yet, beneath that certainty, something had shifted, because now there were connections. The maps, with their geometric lines beneath the ice, the photograph showing shapes that did not dissolve into randomness. And now, the observer, describing formations that did not behave like anything expected. Separate sources, different origins. And yet, aligned. The word returned again, more clearly now. Alignment confirmed. He had dismissed it at first, or tried to. A fragment, a partial phrase. But now it carried a different weight. It was no longer isolated. It belonged to a pattern. He looked at the document again, at the altered lines, the overwritten sentences, the careful adjustments that had shifted meaning without removing it entirely. It was not deletion, it was control. A quiet refinement of narrative, one that allowed certain details to remain, but without context, without clarity, without the weight that would force them to be understood. He stood slowly, gathering the papers, aligning them back into their folder. The motion felt different now, no longer routine, more deliberate, more aware. There was no instruction for what to do with something like this, no protocol for handling inconsistencies that did not declare themselves openly. But there was a choice. He could process the document as intended, assign its classification, place it among the others, and allow it to become part of the system. Or he could pause, question, bring attention to something that had already been adjusted once before. He hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because this did not feel new. It felt repeated, as if others had seen these same inconsistencies, these same fragments, and had made the same decision. To let it remain, unresolved. He returned the document to its place, sliding it into the shelf among similar reports, where it would exist without drawing attention, where it would remain accessible but unnoticed. Just another file. Just another version of what we were taught. And then, something changed. He stepped back, looking at the rows of shelves stretching into the distance, each one filled with records that had been accepted, categorized, preserved. History, arranged into a form that appeared complete. But completeness, he realized, is not always the absence of missing pieces. Sometimes, it is the presence of pieces that have been rearranged. He turned away, the quiet of the room closing around him once more. But the question remained, heavier now, more persistent. If the observer had seen something beneath the ice, something structured, something repeating, something that aligned with the patterns on the maps, then why had the record been altered? Why preserve the trace, but remove the meaning? And if this had happened once, how many other records had been adjusted the same way, quietly, carefully, until what remained was no longer the full story, but only the version we were allowed to remember? It did not come from Antarctica this time, not directly. The next fragment surfaced thousands of miles away, in a place where ice and silence had long since been replaced by industry, noise, and the steady rhythm of a city that rebuilt itself after forgetting what it once was. Chicago, early 1980s. A municipal archive building tucked between newer structures, its exterior unremarkable, its interior filled with records that had survived fire, relocation, and the quiet reshaping of history that followed the Great Fire of 1871. A place where documents were not always preserved intentionally, but sometimes simply endured. The woman who found it was not looking for Antarctica. Her work had nothing to do with polar surveys or naval records. She was cataloguing photographic collections, sorting through boxes that had been donated, transferred, or simply left behind when departments changed, when buildings closed, when ownership became unclear. Her job, like the clerk's, was procedural. Identify the image, assign a date if possible, describe the contents, and file it accordingly. Most photographs were predictable. Streets, buildings, people posed in ways that felt both formal and distant. Fragments of a city that had already been explained, already framed within the narratives we were taught. But this photograph did not belong to Chicago. It had been placed among aerial survey images, likely misfiled at some point, its edges worn, its surface marked by time. There was no caption, no identifying mark, no date stamped along the border, just an image that did not match the collection it had been placed within. That alone would not have been unusual. Misplacements happen, records shift, context is lost. But something about the image held her attention longer than expected. At first, it appeared empty. A wide expanse of white, uneven in texture but consistent in tone. No visible landmarks, no structures, no shadows that would suggest depth or movement. It could have been dismissed as overexposed, a failed photograph, something captured without intention and preserved without reason. But she did not dismiss it. She adjusted the angle under the desk lamp, tilting it slightly, allowing the light to move across the surface. And then, something changed. A faint contrast emerged, not immediately visible, but present once seen. Lines. Subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural variations in the snow, but they did not behave like shadows. They did not shift with the light. They remained fixed, embedded within the image itself. She leaned closer. The lines formed edges, straight edges. They extended across the frame, intersecting at points that felt too precise to ignore. The pattern was incomplete, partially obscured, but enough remained to suggest something larger beyond the boundaries of the photograph, something structured, something deliberate. She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the edges of the image. The room around her continued as it always did, quiet, routine, the soft sounds of paper and movement from other workers passing through their own tasks. But for a moment, none of it felt present. The photograph had isolated itself, pulling her attention inward, narrowing her focus to something that did not belong to the context it had been given. She turned the photograph over. Nothing. No writing. No stamp. No indication of origin. But there was something else. A second photograph, partially stuck to the back, as if they had been pressed together over time. She separated them carefully, the paper resisting slightly before releasing. This second image was darker, its contrast more defined, its composition clearer, and it showed the same place, but from a different angle. This time, the lines were easier to see. They cut across the surface in long, uninterrupted segments, forming intersections that suggested corners, boundaries, outlines of something that extended beyond the visible frame. The geometry was unmistakable. Not perfect, not clean in the way modern structures appear, but intentional in a way that natural formations rarely are. She felt a quiet hesitation, the kind that comes when something familiar begins to feel unfamiliar. The image did not align with what she expected from an aerial survey. It did not match the terrain she was used to cataloguing. And yet, it had been placed here, among photographs that had already been categorized, already understood. She reached for the magnifier. Under closer inspection, the surface of the image revealed more detail. The lines were not drawn. They were not artifacts of printing. They were part of the scene itself. Subtle variations in depth, slight changes in shadow, enough to suggest that whatever lay beneath the surface was not flat, not uniform. Something was there. Beneath the ice. She leaned back slightly, her mind moving through possibilities, searching for something that would make the image fit within known categories. Glacial formations, perhaps. Cracks in the ice, refrozen in unusual patterns. Geological features that appeared structured under certain conditions. But the angles remained. The intersections held. And the pattern did not dissolve into randomness. She set the photographs side by side, comparing them. The alignment was not perfect, but it was consistent. The shapes overlapped in ways that suggested continuity, as if both images captured different segments of the same underlying structure. Structure. The word lingered. She glanced around the room, as if expecting someone else to notice, to confirm, to provide context that she did not have. But no one was looking. No one was paying attention. The archive remained what it had always been, a place of quiet preservation, not active discovery. She reached for the logbook, noting the images, attempting to assign a category. Aerial survey. Unidentified location. Estimated mid-20th century. The description felt insufficient, incomplete, but there was no category for what she was seeing. No classification that allowed for uncertainty without resolution. She paused before writing further, because something else had begun to take shape, not in the photographs themselves, but in the memory of them. The lines. The angles. The intersections. They felt familiar. Not from this archive, not from the collections she had worked with, but from something else, something she could not immediately place. A pattern that had been seen before, somewhere, in a different context. And then, without warning, it surfaced. A reference she had come across weeks earlier, in a separate file. A note, brief and unexplained, attached to a set of documents that had nothing to do with Chicago, nothing to do with urban records. Alignment confirmed. The phrase returned, uninvited, connecting itself to the image in front of her in a way that did not feel accidental. She closed the logbook slowly. The room remained unchanged. The photographs rested on the table, silent, unmarked, offering no explanation beyond what they showed. And yet, something had shifted, because now there was a connection. Not a direct one, not something that could be proven or documented within the boundaries of official records, but a pattern. Antarctica, 1940. Maps with lines that did not belong. An observer, describing formations that did not conform. And now, a photograph, misplaced, unidentified, showing shapes beneath the surface that echoed those same lines. Separate locations, separate records, and yet aligned. She gathered the photographs, placing them back into their sleeve, her movements slower now, more deliberate. The act of filing them felt different. Not routine, not neutral. Because once seen, the pattern could not be unseen. She carried them to the storage cabinet, sliding them into a drawer among thousands of other images, each one labeled, categorized, understood. These were not. She closed the drawer, and then something changed. She hesitated, her hand resting briefly on the handle, as if considering something she could not fully articulate. The archive around her remained quiet, unchanged, its contents undisturbed. But the question had already formed. If these images were captured, if they were preserved, if they existed within the system, then why were they here, without context? Why were they separated from any record that might explain them? And more importantly, how many other fragments had been placed just out of reach, just far enough apart that no one would ever see the pattern they formed together? The next fragment did not arrive as an image or a map. It came as sound, or more precisely, as something that should have been sound, but did not behave the way sound was expected to behave. It surfaced in a naval communications archive in New York, sometime in the mid-1980s, in a building that had once processed signals during wartime, when messages carried urgency, and silence could mean something had gone wrong. By then, the equipment had been replaced, the systems updated, the urgency reduced to records and logs that no longer carried immediate consequence. But the logs remained, they always do. A technician sat at a desk reviewing archive transmissions, part of a routine audit that no one anticipated would reveal anything unexpected. His task was not to interpret, not to question, but simply to verify that records matched their documented parameters, frequencies, timestamps, signal strength, data points that, when aligned, confirmed that systems had functioned as intended, and for the most part, they had. The logs he was reviewing dated back to the early 1940s, corresponding to naval operations in the Southern Hemisphere, including Antarctic survey missions that had been briefly referenced in other documents. The transmissions themselves were not preserved in full, only their recorded characteristics, patterns of communication, reflections, interruptions, enough to confirm that signals had been sent and received, but not enough to reconstruct their full content. He moved through the data methodically, line by line, column by column. Most entries followed expected patterns: signals transmitted, signals received, minor distortions attributed to atmospheric interference, nothing that required further attention. The kind of consistency that allows records to be trusted without question. Until one entry broke that pattern. It was subtle at first, a reflection time that did not match the expected distance. A signal that appeared to return sooner than it should have, given the parameters recorded. He paused, adjusting the log, checking the corresponding data points. Frequency, angle, transmission strength, everything aligned with standard procedure, except the return. It was too fast. Not dramatically so, not enough to suggest immediate error, but enough to create a discrepancy, a difference between what should have happened and what was recorded. He marked the entry, noting the inconsistency, then moved on. One anomaly, in isolation, does not define a pattern, but then there was another, and another, each one slightly different, each one occurring under varying conditions, but all sharing the same characteristic. The signal returned sooner than expected, as if it had encountered something closer than the surface it was meant to reflect from. He leaned back slightly, the quiet hum of the equipment around him becoming more noticeable. The room was dim, lit primarily by the soft glow of monitors and the occasional overhead light. The atmosphere was controlled, contained, much like the records themselves. He returned to the logs, this time scanning for patterns rather than verifying individual entries. The anomalies were not random. They clustered within specific time frames, corresponding to known Antarctic survey operations. The same period, the same region. And then, something changed. He noticed a second layer of inconsistency. In some entries, the return time had been adjusted, not removed, not erased, but modified. The original value remained faintly visible beneath the corrected number, as if someone had overwritten it without fully obscuring the initial recording. The new values aligned with expected parameters. The original ones did not. He stared at the numbers for a moment longer than necessary. Because this was not an error, it was a correction, a quiet one. He cross-referenced the entries with other logs, looking for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that might explain the discrepancy. The patterns held. The adjusted entries aligned with official expectations. The originals did not. He opened a secondary file, one that contained technician notes from the same period. Brief comments, mostly procedural, documenting minor issues, routine adjustments, nothing that suggested concern, until one line, unexpected return depth, source unclear. The note was short, almost reluctant, as if written quickly, without intention to elaborate. There was no follow-up, no additional detail, just a statement that something had been observed and not understood. He read it again. Unexpected return depth. Depth. The word lingered, because signals do not return from depth without encountering something solid, something capable of reflecting. He looked back at the logs, at the altered entries, the adjusted numbers, the quiet corrections that had brought the data back into alignment with expectation. It was not the anomaly itself that stood out. It was the effort to normalize it. To make it fit. He felt that same shift again, the same subtle awareness that had followed the maps, the documents, the photographs, a pattern that was not being erased, but managed, controlled, allowed to exist, but only within certain boundaries. He stood, moving toward a shelf where older equipment logs were stored, searching for anything that might provide context. The records were organized, indexed, accessible, and yet something about them felt incomplete. He found a file corresponding to the same time frame, the same operations. Within it, a series of diagrams illustrating signal paths, expected reflections, standard models used to interpret data. Everything aligned with what he had been taught, with what official records described, but the anomalies did not appear. They had been removed, or rather, replaced. He returned to his desk, the weight of the room settling around him, the hum of the equipment, the quiet presence of records that had already been processed, already accepted. And yet, beneath that acceptance, something remained unresolved. Because now there were more pieces. Maps showing geometric patterns beneath the ice. An observer describing formations that did not conform. Photographs revealing structured shapes where none should exist. And now, signals returning from depths that should have been empty. Separate sources, different forms of observation, and yet aligned. The word returned again, more clearly now, no longer a fragment, but a connection. Alignment confirmed. He did not know where the phrase had come from, not exactly, but it felt as though it belonged here, as though it had been waiting to be understood. He looked at the logs one last time, at the altered numbers, the overwritten values, the quiet adjustments that had reshaped the data without removing it entirely. It was not deletion, it was refinement, a narrowing of possibility. He closed the file, placing it back among the others, restoring the order that had been given to it. But the order no longer felt stable. It felt constructed. Like the lines on the map, like the shapes beneath the ice. He stepped away from the desk, the room returning to its quiet rhythm. But the question remained, heavier now, more persistent. If the signals had encountered something beneath the surface, something solid, something structured, something that existed where nothing was supposed to be, then why had the data been altered? Why preserve the trace, but remove the implication? And if this had happened across maps, documents, photographs, and now signals, then how many layers of observation had been quietly adjusted until what remained was no longer the full record, but only the version that fit within what we were taught? By the time the pattern begins to feel unavoidable, it no longer belongs to a single place. It does not stay contained within Antarctica or within the archives of Washington, Chicago, or New York. It begins to surface elsewhere, quietly, in records that were never meant to be connected, in observations that were never meant to align. And the unsettling part is not that these fragments exist, it is that they appear to echo each other across distances that should prevent any meaningful overlap. It was in Boston, sometime in the early 1990s, inside a university archive that specialized in preserving engineering records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Documents from the industrial era, from a time when America was building upward, outward, redefining what structures could be, often faster than they could be fully understood. Blueprints, design sketches, structural notes, records that belonged to a period often summarized in history books as progress, expansion, invention, a clean narrative, a confident one. A graduate researcher was reviewing a collection of architectural drawings, most of them related to projects that had never been completed, or that had been modified so extensively that their original forms no longer existed. It was routine work, comparing initial designs to final outcomes, documenting changes, tracing the evolution of ideas that had been simplified over time. The kind of research that confirms what we were taught, that progress follows a linear path, that designs improve, that complexity resolves into clarity. But one set of drawings did not follow that pattern. They were older than the rest, dated loosely to the mid-1800s, though the exact year was uncertain. The paper had aged differently. The ink faded in a way that suggested not just time, but exposure to conditions that were not typical for preserved documents. The drawings themselves were precise, detailed, but strangely incomplete. Sections were missing, not torn away, not damaged, but simply absent, as if the design had been interrupted. At first, the researcher assumed it was just another unfinished project, a concept that had never moved beyond early stages. But as he examined the remaining sections, something began to feel familiar, not in content, but in structure. The lines, they were straight, not unusual in architectural drawings, of course. Precision is expected. But these lines extended beyond what the visible design required. They continued past boundaries, intersected at points that did not correspond to walls, supports, or any recognizable feature. They formed a grid that existed beneath the visible structure, not aligned with it, but supporting it in a way that did not make immediate sense. He traced one of the intersections with his finger, following it across the page. The angle was exact, the alignment consistent. It was not decorative, it was not accidental, it was foundational. He flipped to another page. The same pattern appeared, and another. Across multiple drawings, the underlying grid remained consistent, even as the visible structures changed. It was not part of the design being presented. It was something beneath it. Something that had been there before the design was applied. He leaned back slightly, the quiet of the archive settling around him. The room was filled with other documents, other records, all of them fitting neatly into the narrative of architectural progress. But these drawings did not feel like progress. They felt like adaptation, as if the visible structures had been placed onto something that already existed. He searched for accompanying notes, for any explanation that might clarify the purpose of the underlying grid. There were annotations, but they referred only to the visible elements. Materials, dimensions, load calculations, nothing that addressed the deeper pattern. And then he noticed something else. A small note, written in the margin, almost overlooked. Alignment maintained. The phrase was brief, incomplete, but it carried a weight that did not belong to routine documentation. It was not a measurement, not a calculation. It was a confirmation. He stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Because it felt familiar, not from these drawings, not from this archive, but from something else. Something that had appeared in a different context, a different place, a different time. Alignment confirmed. The words were not identical, but they echoed each other. He closed the folder slowly, the sense of familiarity deepening into something more unsettling. Because now the pattern extended beyond Antarctica. Beyond maps and photographs and signal logs, it had appeared in architectural records from a completely different era, a different purpose, a different context, and yet aligned. He stood, moving toward a window at the far end of the room, looking out over the city. Boston, layered with history, with structures that had been built, rebuilt, modified, preserved. A city that, like many others, carried traces of its past beneath its present, foundations beneath foundations, layers beneath layers. He wondered, briefly, how many of those layers had been fully understood, how many had simply been built over. He returned to the table, reopening the drawings, studying them with a different perspective now, not as isolated designs, but as fragments of something larger. The underlying grid did not conform to the visible structures. It existed independently of them, as if the structures had been designed to fit it, or to hide it. He considered the possibility that it was simply a design technique, an early method of planning, something that had been abandoned or replaced over time. But the consistency across unrelated drawings suggested otherwise. It was too precise, too intentional, too persistent. He gathered the documents, returning them to their folder, but the act felt incomplete, as if something had been left unresolved, because now there were more connections. Antarctica, 1940. Maps showing geometric patterns beneath the ice. An observer describing formations that did not conform. Photographs revealing structured shapes where none should exist. Signal logs indicating reflections from unexpected depths. And now, architectural drawings from the 1800s, containing underlying grids that did not belong to the visible design. Separate disciplines. Separate locations, separate time periods, and yet aligned. He placed the folder back on the shelf, stepping away slowly, the quiet of the archive closing around him once more. But the question had already formed, and it would not leave. If these patterns existed across such different contexts, if they appeared in places that should have no connection, then what exactly was being aligned? What existed beneath these records, beneath these structures, beneath the ice itself, that could connect them all? And more importantly, why did every trace of it appear only in fragments, never fully explained, never fully acknowledged, as if the complete picture was something that was never meant to be seen all at once? By the time the fragments begin to converge, they no longer feel accidental. Not in the way isolated anomalies can be dismissed, not in the way a single document or photograph can be explained away as error, misinterpretation, or coincidence. Because now, the pattern exists across too many layers, too many disciplines, too many places that were never meant to intersect. And yet, they do, quietly, incomplete, but consistent. It returns again to Washington, though not to the same room, not to the same moment. This time, it surfaces in a different part of the system, a restricted archive that holds records not meant for routine handling, documents that require clearance beyond procedural access. The kind of place where materials are not simply stored, but contained, where context is preserved, but not necessarily shared. A senior archivist sits alone, reviewing a request that should not have been approved. The file number references multiple sources, drawn from different departments, different time periods, different classifications. Antarctic survey materials, naval communication logs, architectural records, photographic archives, each one incomplete on its own, but now, grouped together. That, more than anything, feels unusual. Because records are not typically organized this way. They are categorized by origin, by purpose, by context, not by pattern. He opens the file slowly. Inside, the documents are familiar, though he cannot immediately place why. The maps, the altered reports, the photographs, the signal logs, the architectural drawings. Each one appears as a fragment, a copy, a reproduction of something that exists elsewhere in the system. But here, they have been gathered, not explained, not summarized, simply aligned. He studies them in silence. At first, they remain what they have always been, disconnected pieces, each carrying its own ambiguity, its own unresolved questions. But then, as his attention moves between them, something begins to shift, not in the documents themselves, but in the space between them, the lines. They appear again, not physically, not drawn across the pages, but implied. The geometric patterns from the Antarctic maps, the angles described by the observer, the shapes visible in the photographs, the reflections suggested by the signal logs, the underlying grids in the architectural drawings, each one incomplete, each one partial, but together they begin to form something larger. He leans closer, not to a single document, but to the idea of them as a whole. The alignment is not perfect, it is not clean. There are gaps, inconsistencies, missing segments, but the structure is there, beneath the fragments, connecting them in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. It does not resemble a natural formation. It does not resemble a known design. It resembles something older, not in age alone, but in intention, as if the pattern existed before the records that describe it, before the observations that attempt to capture it, as if the documents are not the origin of the pattern, but reflections of it. He turns to a final page within the file. It is not a map, not a photograph, not a report. It is a summary, brief, controlled, written in a tone that avoids speculation, avoids conclusion, avoids anything that might extend beyond what can be formally acknowledged. Multiple sources indicate recurring geometric anomalies across unrelated datasets. No confirmed origin, no verified structure, further correlation not authorized. He reads it again. Further correlation not authorized. The phrase lingers, because it suggests something that has not been stated directly. That correlation was possible, and then something changed. He looks back at the documents, at the way they have been arranged, not by origin, but by pattern. This file should not exist. Not in this form. Not with these materials placed together. It contradicts the very structure of the archive itself. And yet, it does. Which means someone, at some point, saw the same connections. Someone gathered these fragments. Someone aligned them. And then stopped. He searches for additional pages, follow-up reports, extended analysis, anything that might explain why the correlation was halted. There is nothing, no continuation, no conclusion, only the fragments, and the decision to go no further. He sits back slowly, the weight of the room settling around him. The archive remains quiet, controlled, its contents ordered in a way that suggests completeness. But now, that order feels different, constructed, not to preserve everything, but to preserve enough. He closes the file carefully, aligning the pages as they were before. The act feels deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if restoring something to a state that is meant to remain undisturbed. But the question has already formed. If these patterns exist across such different records, if they appear beneath ice, within signals, inside architectural designs, across time itself, then what exactly is being reflected? What exists beneath all of it, connecting these fragments in ways that official records refuse to acknowledge? He stands, returning the file to its place, sliding it back into the restricted shelf, where it will remain unseen, unreferenced, unconnected, just another collection of unrelated materials. Just another version of history, arranged in a way that makes sense. But as he steps away, something remains. Not a conclusion, not an answer, a possibility. That what we were taught as isolated events may not be isolated at all. That beneath the surface of recorded history, beneath the structures we recognize, beneath even the ice itself, there may be a pattern, not fully visible, not fully understood, but present, waiting. And if that pattern was seen, recorded, and then deliberately left incomplete, then the final question is not what was discovered, it is this. What would happen if the alignment was ever allowed to be finished? Word count, 1,519. There are those who might suggest that all of this is coincidence, that patterns can emerge where none were intended, that the human mind seeks structure even in randomness, connecting fragments that were never meant to form a whole. That the maps were flawed, the observer mistaken, the photographs misinterpreted, the signals distorted, the architectural drawings misunderstood. That everything fits, eventually, if we adjust our expectations enough. And perhaps that is true, or perhaps there are other possibilities. That what was seen beneath the Antarctic ice in 1940 was not a natural formation, but the remnant of something constructed, something that existed before the continent became what we recognize today. Its outlines preserved only in fragments, its structure buried beneath layers that time has made inaccessible. A possibility that does not confirm anything, but raises questions about what history might look like if certain pieces were never removed. Or that the patterns are not remnants, but reflections. That the geometry observed across maps, signals, and designs is not tied to a single location, but to a system, something that exists beyond any one place. Something that has been encountered in different forms, across different times, interpreted through the limited frameworks available to those who observed it. Or perhaps something else entirely. Something that does not fit within the categories we have defined. Something that resists explanation not because it is hidden, but because it has never been fully understood. The documents do not say. They never do. They present fragments, observations, adjustments, and then silence. And in that silence, the question remains, not what was found, not what was recorded, but what was left unfinished. Because if the alignment was real, even partially, even imperfectly, then what lies beneath it may still be there, unchanged, unseen, waiting. and the only thing separating it from being understood may be the decision to finally look at all the pieces together.